For most of human history, feeding a baby was one of the most dangerous things a family could do. If the mother couldn't breastfeed, the options were terrifying. Animal milk, served raw and unwashed, bread soaked in water and called food. A stranger paid to feed your child with no way to know what she was really doing. And in some institutions, the death rate for babies who weren't breastfed reached 99%. This is not ancient history. This was happening less than 200 years ago, and the silence around it is one of the strangest gaps in everything we are taught about the past. Today, if a baby can't breastfeed, there is an answer. You go to a pharmacy, you buy a tin of formula, you follow the instructions, and the baby grows. The system is so reliable that millions of parents use it every single day without thinking about it. But that simple option did not exist for almost all of human history, for thousands of years. If breastfeeding failed, the family was in genuine danger of losing the child, and often they did. This was not a rare problem. Breastfeeding could fail for many reasons. The mother could die in childbirth. She could be too ill to feed. She could be undernourished and produce too little milk. She could be forced to work long hours in factories, far from the baby, unable to feed on demand. She could have a baby who simply couldn't latch. Across every century and every class, these situations were common, and in every one of them, the question became the same. What do you feed a baby when the mother cannot? We are about to look at the terrifying answers to that question. But if you appreciate these deep dives into the forgotten history that shaped our world, take a second to hit subscribe. It helps bring more of these stories to light. For most of history, the first answer was another woman, a wet nurse, another mother, usually one who had recently given birth herself, who was paid to breastfeed someone else's child. In wealthy households, wet nurses were standard. Breastfeeding by aristocratic women was considered unfashionable for centuries. But fashion was only part of the reason. Breastfeeding suppresses fertility. A woman who is nursing is much less likely to conceive, and aristocratic families needed heirs, quickly, reliably, often before the previous child had even left infancy, because the infant mortality rate was so high that a single surviving heir was never enough. A noblewoman who breastfed her own child was a noblewoman who could not produce the next one. So, noble babies were handed to other women immediately after birth, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The mother might barely hold her own infant. The wet nurse became, in practice, the mother. But wet nursing carried its own risks. A good wet nurse was difficult to find. A bad one could mean the death of the baby. She might be diseased. She might be malnourished and unable to produce enough milk. She might have lost her own infant and be desperate enough to take any work, or she might be feeding several babies at once and prioritizing her own. For the poor families whose babies were given away to be wet nursed in the countryside, the situation was often catastrophic. Peasant wet nurses were legally required to obtain a license and to report the death of any infant in their care. Unfortunately, the laws were ignored and created little change in the high infant mortality rate. Some babies were sent away and were never seen by their parents again because they didn't survive long enough to return. If a wet nurse could not be found or could not be afforded, families turned to what was called dry nursing, hand feeding, without breast milk at all. This was the moment things became truly dangerous, because there was no formula, there were no clean bottles, there was no understanding of bacteria or sterilization, there was no science of infant nutrition, there was only what was available in the house: milk from an animal, bread or flour cooked in water or milk, mixed in whatever vessel could be found, fed to the baby with whatever could be improvised: a horn, a spoon, a piece of cloth dipped in liquid. The most common food for these babies was something called pap. A 1676 recipe describes it as barley bread steeped in water and boiled in milk. That was the food. For an infant whose digestive system could not process bread, whose body needed protein and antibodies and fats that pap simply did not contain. The variations were endless. Some used wheat flour instead of barley. Some added an egg yolk, some thinned it with broth. A similar mixture called panada was made from bread cooked in water or milk. But the principle was always the same. Cereal, water, a baby, hope, and nothing else. The babies fed this way often did not thrive. They grew slowly. They developed digestive disorders. They struggled to put on weight, and they were extraordinarily vulnerable to infection. Diarrheal illness, in particular, became the single greatest killer of these infants. A baby on pap had almost no immune protection. A baby on raw animal milk was drinking whatever bacteria had grown in that milk since it was drawn from the animal. A baby fed from an unwashed horn or spoon was being introduced to disease with every meal. The result was a quiet, devastating mortality rate that was simply accepted as part of life. But to understand the true scale of what was happening, you need to look at the foundling hospitals. These were institutions across Europe set up to care for abandoned or orphaned infants. Babies left at the doors of churches, babies of mothers who could not keep them, babies whose parents had died. The institutions tried to feed these infants without breast milk. And what happened is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of childhood. In the Foundling Hospital in Dublin, founded in 1702, 99.6% of all children under 1 died. None were wet nursed. The hospital closed in 1829. 99.6%. Out of every 1,000 babies admitted, 4 survived their first year. This was not unique to Dublin. Foundling hospitals across Europe recorded catastrophic mortality. The babies were not being neglected in the way we might imagine. They were being fed. They were being kept warm. They were being cared for by women who genuinely wanted them to live. But the food was killing them. The pap killed them. The unpasteurized animal milk killed them. The unwashed vessels killed them. The complete absence of any safe alternative to breast milk killed them. And for over a century, nobody could solve it. Across this same period, the infant mortality rate for the general population was also brutal. In European and American societies of the early and mid-19th century, infant mortality rates were 30 to 60 times higher than the rates today. 30 to 60 times. In some districts of industrial Europe, 1 in every 3 babies died before their first birthday. In the poorest urban areas, closer to half. A working-class mother might give birth to 10 children and bury 5 of them before any reached the age of 2. This was so common that families often didn't name their babies for months. It was easier to grieve a child who had not yet been named. And underneath all of it was the fundamental problem of feeding. Breastfeeding worked. It had always worked. But the systems around it were fragile. A mother's death meant the child's death. A mother's illness meant the child's illness. A mother's job meant the child was handed to someone else or to something else. And every alternative, every substitute, every desperate solution was a roll of the dice. The Industrial Revolution made it worse. As women moved from agricultural to factory work, many were forced to work long hours away from home, making frequent breastfeeding impossible. The poor had no time to feed their babies. The wealthy had a fashion against feeding their babies, and the babies were what paid the price. The breakthrough finally came in 1865. A German chemist named Justus von Liebig developed, patented, and marketed an infant food, first in liquid form and then in powdered form for better preservation. His formula consisted of cow's milk, wheat and malt flour, and potassium bicarbonate. It was called Liebig's soluble food for babies. It was crude by today's standards. It lacked vitamins. It lacked the immune properties of breast milk. It could not match what a mother's body produced. But it was a start. For the first time in human history, a chemist had attempted to engineer infant food based on science rather than guesswork, and it could be made consistently, sold in tins, mixed with boiled water, standardized. 2 years later, a Swiss-based pharmacist named Henri Nestlé launched Farine Lactée Nestlé in 1867, made with similar ingredients but easier to prepare. Nestlé tested his formula on infants who could not be breastfed. He used the story of saving a premature baby from starvation to market his product as a mother's milk substitute. And the product sold quickly. By the 1880s, there were at least 27 brands of infant food available. A market that had not existed 20 years earlier was suddenly enormous. Because the demand had always been there, it had been there for thousands of years. It just had nowhere to go until now. But the early formulas did not solve the problem completely. They could fatten a baby, but they often lacked essential nutrients. Babies on early formula developed conditions caused by vitamin deficiencies. Some lost their sight from vitamin A deficiency. Some developed scurvy from lack of vitamin C. Some developed rickets from lack of vitamin D. And the cow's milk used in the formulas was often still contaminated. It was not until Louis Pasteur's work was applied to milk, not until pasteurization became widespread, not until clean bottles and sterilization became standard, that infant feeding finally became safe. That took until the early 20th century, meaning that for most of the time, human civilization has existed. Feeding a baby who could not be breastfed was a slow gamble against death. The infant mortality rate began to fall sharply. The combination of safer feeding, pasteurized milk, clean water, vaccinations, and basic hygiene transformed survival rates within just a few generations. What had been a near certainty of losing a child became increasingly rare. A working-class family in 1900 still expected to lose at least one child. By 1950, most did not. By today, infant mortality in developed countries is below 5 per thousand. For every 1,000 babies born, at least 995 survived their first year. The Dublin Foundling Hospital had a survival rate of 4 per thousand. The change is almost too large to comprehend. Today, a parent who cannot breastfeed walks into a shop, picks up a tin, mixes the powder with boiled water, and feeds their baby. The system is so simple, so reliable, so completely ordinary, that nobody thinks about it. But behind that simple act is a history that almost no one talks about. A history of pap and contaminated milk and unwashed horns. A history of wet nurses sent into the countryside with babies who never came back. A history of foundling hospitals where almost no child survived. A history of mothers bearing children so routinely that they delayed naming them. The reason this history is so quiet is because nobody wanted to remember it. It was too painful, too universal, too close to every family. But the thing that ended it was not a war won or a treaty signed. It was a powder in a tin, mixed with clean water, fed from a clean bottle, to a baby who would have died in any previous century. The most dangerous thing in history was not always a weapon. Sometimes it was the absence of something this simple. And if you want to see what else we take for granted, that used to be deadly, subscribe, because the next one is going to surprise you.